This is Professor Grodman with a review of chapters 1 through 3. Apparently, there were some technical issues last night I was not aware of. Apparently, it's the laptop. Uh, uh, Not the. Some people have been suggesting the speaker. I wouldn't know, but didn't realize till the early this morning because I did it twice. Can you imagine? I did for both sections. How silly. And anyway, this is an attempt to compensate for my technical challenges and lack of perceptiveness. And hopefully this will prepare you well for your exam. So this audio is specific to Psych 11101, your Monday, Wednesday, summer 20. But I guess other sections may hear this as well. And there's another summer section coming up and they may hear this as well. Uh, so let's get to the meat and potatoes of the matter and talk about psychology. And by definition, psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. Behavior is observable. Mental processes are not, you may remember. Freud, the pioneer of not psychology, but rather psychoanalysis. And Pavlov, and these are the key players. These are, again, some of the key players in the history of psychology. Pavlov is the father or pioneer of classical conditioning, learning based on pairings or associations. B.F. Skinner is associated with operant, sometimes referred to as instrumental conditioning. And this deals with learning based on consequences. So that is B.F. Skinner. Carl Rogers, you may recall, is associated with positive regard. And there are two types of positive regard, conditional and unconditional. The unconditional positive regard is the most desirable of the two, but sometimes people will still be motivated, certainly most people are, to get regarded, and even if there are contingencies, even if it requires them to do certain things to get that feedback, to get that response. And that latter one is the conditional positive regard. Should also be aware of the name Abraham Maslow. He's associated with a hierarchy of needs model. Remember, there are 5 levels, the highest being self-actualization. That pyramid. Basic needs are physiological, then safety needs, love and belonging, 3rd level, achievement, the 4th level, and self-actualization. For the purpose of this exam, I think we're going to get into this more when we talk about personality, so I don't want to make this more complicated than it already is, which I don't think is too complicated, but anyway, should just know Maslow, hierarchy of needs, and self-actualization. Psychology is becoming, as a discipline, more biological, but social and psychological factors are still considered, so this ties in with the biopsychosocial model. As a discipline, psychology and psychiatry are unique and separate. Psychologists have as credentials PhDs or PsyDs, PsyDs, doctorates of psychology, usually requiring about 5 years after earning a baccalaureate degree. Psychiatrists are physicians with MDs and usually 3 years of training beyond their medical degree. Psychology, getting back specifically to psychology, is a field that is now been a bit subdivided and specialized. The most common subfield of psychology is clinical psychology. School psychology is another area in which the focus is on testing, often for learning issues. The most common learning disability is dyslexia. Industrial organizational psychologists work in work settings, businesses, trying to improve worker satisfaction and productivity. Those two are often connected. And finally, experimental psychologists do research. Speaking of research, one of the areas of research that is focused on is the question of nature-nurture. How much of behavior is biological, when we look at it through the prism of today, which is much more biological, and how much is nurture, environmentally influenced. And the general conclusion is about 50-50, although some argue today that intelligence is a bit more nature-based than nurture. Some research methods employed. It's sort of surprising, I guess. I was going to say not surprisingly, but actually sort of surprisingly, the case study, an individual case, human or animal subject, is actually not used that often. The most commonly used research method is called the survey method, in which large groups are questioned. There usually are actually questionnaires, and you're getting attitudinal data and looking at often demography with response. So, for example, the person's education with their attitude toward a particular topic like mental health. A design or another experimental research method, actually called the experimental or scientific method, this looks at cause and effect. And we're going to highlight this one in our discussion, this review. And we, as you recall from the earlier audio and WebEx, I think we got this far with WebEx. Anyway, certainly on audio we did. Any sort of research, you do a lit review, see what's been done before. From there, you develop basic suppositions and ideas of what is going to happen in your studies, or hypotheses or hypothesis. For example, it's often easier to outline this and illustrate this with drug examples, drug study examples. Drug A reduces depression. Okay, how would you study that? Well, you'd want to get a group of people who probably have depression, and you randomly select a small number from a much larger database. That's random selection. And then you'd randomly assign those folks into two groups. The control group gets the placebo or sugar pill that looks exactly like the drug. Both drugs look exactly the same. Well, the one's actual drug, the other one's a placebo, but they look exactly the same. So the placebo is given to the control group. The experimental group gets the actual drug A. This is referred to, the actual drug, as the independent variable, the thing that is being manipulated and controlled by the researcher. One of the concerns of this research is that expectations can affect the study, so that a technician may, have an expectation about who's getting a drug, or maybe the subject themselves thinks they're getting something. Well, they control for this, they limit this, and really almost eliminate this by making certain that both the subjects and the people, the technicians giving the medication or the placebo, don't know who's getting what. This is called the double-blind procedure. And then there is a period in which the drug is given and the placebo is given, and then they compare the groups using some sort of measure like a checklist of depression. That's called the dependent variable, that measure. Do this statistical analyses. If the hypotheses are supported, often they'll do the research with another group of people. They'll use another sample, and that's doing this over and over again with large numbers of samples. It's called a meta-analysis, And typically, subjects in any of these studies are interviewed at the end to sort of find out what their experiences were like, if any, maybe an impropriety, maybe there was something, again, improper, or just to refer them to appropriate resources at the end. This is called, again, debriefing. Okay, getting into more of the biological, some basic terms we talked about. Neurons are brain cells, neurotransmitters, chemical agents in your brain which affect mood, behavior, and thinking. This is a slightly more applied than academic definition, but should serve you well in terms of the exam. Anything that is neurological pertains to the brain. Neurological disorders, well, there are many of them. We talked a bit, I think, about Alzheimer's, which is a subtype of dementia. Actually, also has depression with it oftentimes. But it's the most common form of dementia or memory loss. Initially more short-term memory, then followed by more long-term memory. It is biologically related to a loss of neurons in the part of the brain, the limbic system called the hippocampus, part of the brain dealing with memory, and an associated neurotransmitter or chemical agent called acetylcholine, acetylcholine. Although the primary characteristics of Alzheimer's are memory and cognitive, there are other symptoms like aphasia, loss of language. We briefly touched upon schizophrenia, which, although relating to the brain, is considered a psychiatric, not a neurological disorder. Schizophrenia is characterized by delusions, grossly distorted belief systems, or hallucinations, sensory experiences and perceptual experiences that other people don't have, and really connects to two neurotransmitters. One, serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter connected to mood, and another, dopamine, which has a lot, really that's the prime neurotransmitter with schizophrenia, that an excess of dopamine is the prime agent that results or produces the aforementioned hallucinatory or delusional experiences. A brief description of the some structures and functions of the brain. The brain can be divided into three divisions: the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. The hindbrain consists of specific structures such as the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. So let's touch upon some of these structures. The medulla is involved in vital reflexes such as heartbeat, swallowing, and breathing. Pons involved in the coordination of the left and right sides of the body. One that I did not mention before, but one you should know, or I think we did mention in our initial introduction, the reticular formation, involved and responsible for general attention and being able to focus on something. Finally, the cerebellum is connected with movement and also short-term memory. Moving on from the hindbrain to the forebrain. The forebrain consists of two hemispheres, left and right. The left hemisphere is primarily verbal. The right hemisphere is primarily nonverbal. Information goes back and forth between the hemispheres via a structure called the corpus callosum, C-O-L-L-O-S. I think it's U-M or O-M. I think it's U-M. Either way, you'll recognize it if you see it on the exam. And actually, information, although the left is primarily verbal, things like vocabulary, general knowledge, on the right is primarily nonverbal. For example, facial imagination, creativity, observation, I guess, of others, abstract reasoning, that is, like geometry would be an example academically. These are all nonverbal examples, nonverbal functions. There are verbal functions on the right and nonverbal functions on the left, although the predominance of the right is nonverbal, predominance of the left is verbal. Also, the midbrain is involved with sensory and motor functions. As I go through my notes. Okay, you should also be familiar with the fact that the structure called the cortex. Cortex covers the outer part of the brain and is divided into four areas or lobes. Each of these lobes has particular functions. So you may have heard of the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe, as we talked about, numerous functions such as emotions, language. Emotions, when you think about, I think we may have mentioned, the lobotomies that were performed in the 1930s and 40s, which were connected to this recognition that there was a biological behavioral connection between the brain and behavior. And although that was correct and valid, these procedures, these psychosurgeries, were not very effective. In fact, often diminished intellectual functioning. There is a structure on the frontal lobe called the Broca's area. This deals with expressive language. If there is impairment to this, such as a stroke, it may result in what's known as Broca's aphasia, where receptive language is fine, understanding, but spoken language is impaired. So that's one lobe. The occipital lobe contains the primary visual centers and involved in functions such as recognizing faces or patterns. So if there's damage here, a person may not recognize another person, may not be able to reproduce. If you were asked to draw a circle, that might be an impossible task, and actually show a circle as a visual representation to that person. They may have a very difficult time, and if not impossible time, reproducing that. So that's the second lobe. The parietal lobe deals with sensory functions such as taste and temperature. Temporal lobe deals with, that's the fourth one, hearing and speaking language. So this one is sort of an extension of what some of the functions of the frontal lobe are. And there's an area you may remember called the Wernicke's area. This deals with both understanding and speaking language. And if there is spoken language, and if there's impairment here, that's called Wernicke's aphasia. This is akin to an Alzheimer's-like aphasia. You peel away the lobes, you come upon the limbic system. Limbic system involved in motivational behaviors, such as thirst and hunger and things that are obviously vital for survival. Let's go through some of the structures of the limbic system. The thalamus with sensory processes such as hearing, sight, touch, and taste. Hypothalamus with some of the things I mentioned before: hunger, sleep, thirst, sexual activity. This is very much akin to what Freud called the ID. Freud did not use the term hypothalamus, to my knowledge, or the even term brain very often, if at all. Used the term mind. But when he talked about the ID, he talked about primal biological needs and impulses. That very much connects to this hypothalamus. Continuing on, the hippocampus deals with memory and learning. And with Alzheimer's, the loss of neurons in the hippocampus. The amygdala, dealing with emotional memories, often traumatic in content, such as being attacked. Research indicates that animals who have had amygdalas removed, I guess the research, are just not able to remember the experience of being attacked and are more vulnerable then. So there probably is some human analogy in terms of some of the damage that occurs, not only neurobiological damage, but even the effects of psychological damage on neuroanatomy that may affect structures such as the amygdala. Okay, let's sort of get into chapter 3, and this is brief. Sensation. You should know the 5 senses: vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch. The 5 tastes: sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and the new taste in town, umami, umami, that chicken broth like taste. The more you're exposed to these senses or tastes, the more neutral they become. This is called habituation or desensitization. So every day you have a view of Manhattan from your apartment on the Hudson River, and it's a gorgeous view of the panorama of the skyline and the expanse of the Hudson. But every day you look at it, it's not quite the same. It becomes more neutered, and that's more neutral, and that's desensitization. Just to also note a term that is probably on your sheet: a decibel level. That's a unit of loudness, obviously tying into the sensation of hearing. Perception and sensation are connected. Perceptions connect to how we process sensory stimuli. And this is how we process is highly subjective, influenced by our makeup and our learning histories. So everyone has a different way of perceiving something. Many psychological tests provide relatively ambiguous stimuli, like the Rorschach ink blot test. And the idea is that everyone perceives something. Although there are actually common responses, there's a lot of variance in those responses because of our individual makeup, psychobiologically. So that very much those sort of tests they're called projective tests, rely very much on perception. They're really measures almost of how we perceive the world or an attempt to interpret that. Perception is complex enough that we as human beings need to simplify our perceptual experiences. And that's the term perceptual constancies fall into this, that these are ways of sort of reducing and simplifying our the process of perceiving. So remember size constancy, whether you're a foot away from something or 2 feet away or 3 feet, you're probably going to perceive it the same way, because the recalibration of every step or every change in position would be just too difficult. So this sort of seeing it as the same, whether you're a foot or 5 feet away, an object is size constancy. Now, if you were 1,000 feet away or 100, it might not apply. Probably would not. If you have an image of your cell phone, you're carrying it, and part of it is obstructed, you're still going to see it as sort of rectangular in shape. That's called shape constancy. And if you look outside and see the sun shining, you're probably not going to notice every nuance of a cloud that passes and the brightness changing. We don't do that, and that probably makes our lives just more manageable. The name for that process or that perceptual constancy is called brightness constancy. Finally, there is something, it's not a constancy, but another construct relating to perception that we'll talk about, and we have talked about, called similarity. That if two or three or four things look the same, for example, 4 people are in a military uniform of similar rank, I guess, and we see these men or women as the same when they're probably quite dissimilar. in many ways. So the notion of seeing things, sort of generalizing, grouping, categorizing, is called similarity. Okay, I guess this brings us to the end of our review and hopefully puts you in good stead for your first exam.